Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the National Humanities Center Humanities in Class webinar series. Tonight's session is titled, Can the Jonestown Massacre Help Us Understand Other Acts of Terrorism? My name is Andy Mink. I am the Vice President of Education Programs at the Center. I want to welcome you back after a not long enough holiday break. I hope all of you had a wonderful Thanksgiving. I hope you're sort of embracing that really weird time between Thanksgiving and Christmas in any kind of classroom. I know it's a hectic time for you in one way. It's also a time of infinite optimism that another break is coming. I mean, we do appreciate you taking time from your busy evenings. In some cases, likely you've just left your classroom to engage in this conversation with us. It's always fascinating for me, fun for me to look through the roster and see who's chiming in and checking in as you arrive in the room. It's fun to see that folks are scattered literally all over the country. Some are as close as a few miles down the road in Winston-Salem, like Jason is. Others like Robert in Pennsylvania or Lauren in Virginia are here on the East Coast and probably home and have just had dinner with their family. And then there's a whole lot of folks on the West Coast who are, again, just likely shedding their classroom doors. Maybe they're still in their classrooms. Grace is in Berkeley. Nicole and Misha are in Los Angeles. Part of, I think, the benefit of these webinars is not just the conversation with a scholar, but what's growing to be a cohort of teachers who are having these conversations around the humanities, and I hope being able to identify why the humanities are so important. I do want to say a little bashfully, actually, that tonight I hope we do not encounter this, but if we encounter any technical difficulties, please be patient with me. One of the nice things about working with teachers as long and as often as I have is that I know we all work with our knees bent. I remember all too well, very vividly, the trepidation of wondering if the internet would flicker out in the middle of class, or that activity you planned and maybe longer ago, the bulb in the overhead projector would bust, and those things were too expensive for the librarian to give you an extra. I'm having a little bit of problems with my internet here at home, and if I've double checked this as much as I can, if for some reason I flicker out, the room should stay static. Now, it may freeze for a moment, and if that happens, please just be patient. I'm going to rush back in as quickly as I can, and things should sort of reanimate and be back in place. But if we experience any of those difficulties tonight, just be patient. Give me a few moments, and I have a feeling that it'll be fine. So that's. I cross my fingers that nothing will happen tonight, but if it does, I'm going to count on all of your teaching sensibilities to just relax for a few moments and let me sort it out on this end. Of course, when I work with my team, both Libby and Mike, we often say these kinds of things to each other because all of us have been in the classroom. In fact, between us, we have 27 years in the public school classrooms, and it's very important for us that the work we do is relevant and engages teachers from a leadership capacity, from an agency of the professionals that you are. I want to thank Libby and Mike for all their hard work with the initiatives we have here at the center. And I've included our Twitter and emails on purpose. Please don't hesitate to reach out to us if you'd ever like to give us feedback or request that we respond to a particular need that you might have in any of the work that we do. The National Humanities Center is very pleased to be able to bridge the gap between elite and established humanities scholarship and humanities education. Since 1978, the center has supported an annual fellowship class. We have just an amazing, creative, and innovative team of university professionals every single day who come to this building and do their work in terms of research and writing and editing and conversations. Our education work is designed to connect all that work with classrooms and vice versa. And so the projects that we have, the initiatives, the work that we do like tonight is designed to put scholars and educators in conversations so that the humanities can become not just a luxury that we do when math is over and standardized tests are finished, but a very important tool to help develop and inspire the next generation of citizens in our country. The humanities are an important and necessary and critical tool to that work. If you go to our website, you'll see evidence of all of what we do at the center. It's a new website. It's going to look different than it has in the past. We spent a lot of time over the last 6 months indexing all of our inventory and making it searchable and speak to each other. So our scholarly work, our education work, and our outreach work all can be found in the same way, in the same fashion. I'd encourage you to go and check out our website at any point. You can have updates not only on the work we do in education, but also see the scholarship that's happening from the fellows on an annual basis. Our webinars are intended to be conversations, and so David and I will engage in a conversation around this compelling topic tonight. But even though we can't hear you, all of your voices are equally important. The chat box is located at the bottom of the Go to Training control panel. Many of you are now registering where you're from and sort of greeting each other, giving high fives. Good evening to Michelle from New Jersey. It's important for us that you respond to questions, that you offer your own thoughts, that you share how you might approach this in your classroom or with your younger students, and that you ask questions of our lead scholar. We really want you to be as engaged as possible and to get from this conversation and this talk as much as you can and the kinds of work that you'll find the most relevant for your classroom. A couple of quick announcements about our webinar series. I checked the rosters for our upcoming sessions just before we went live tonight, and we do have a few seats open in a few webinars. When I last looked, there was literally a single seat. It's way in the back behind the Fenway pole. For our next webinar scheduled for December 10th, we'll be working with Xing Hang from Brandeis University outside of Boston. The title will be Post-1990s Developments in China's Relationship to the World. And we also have rescheduled a session that we had originally planned for earlier this fall with Akram Kader, who's a former fellow and a professor of history at North Carolina State University. At last count, there were 96 seats left. That's largely because when we had to reschedule the session, those of you who originally signed up for it lost those seats, so we need you to re-sign up. So right now it's first come, first serve, so 96 seats left for that April 21st session. And we've had to reschedule Johnny Smith and his work with us on Jackie Robinson and civil rights history. Instead of it happening, I think next week or maybe the week after, we've had to postpone that until April 28th. So if you signed up for Dr. Smith's session, that roster will remain intact and you're still a part of it, but it will not be before Christmas, but rather later in the spring semester. We've got 3 more webinars, including tonight's, before the end of our first semester. And as I've said throughout the fall, those of you who have attended everything you've signed up for will be issued a private VIP link to sign up for a special invitation only webinar with Mark Aronson and Marina Burros. We'll be working with them on understanding the barbaric history of sugar, and in particular its role in the 1619 project. The session itself is scheduled for January 7th, but I'll be sending this link out next Friday. That is the day after the last webinar of our semester. A couple other announcements. It's wonderful to work with so many of you in this online format. It's great to be able to reach across the country, but we also do a lot of on-site work. And in the summer, we like to bring cohorts of educators from all levels to the center to really deeply engage with resources, materials, and scholars. We have several opportunities that might be of interest. We have a summer institute scheduled for July, in which we will be working with a team of scholars to understand the complex layers of Southeast Asia in a project titled Contested Territory, America's Role in Southeast Asia, 1945 to 1975. And while we certainly will be talking about the American Vietnam War in the 1960s and early 70s, we'll also be looking at Southeast Asia in a much more holistic way, much more humanist way, stretching back to the end of the World War II period, Dien Bien Phu, the fight against colonial France. So if you'd like to be a part of that, it does come with a $2,100 stipend, and we are currently accepting applications. These applications will be due on March the 1st. We'll make notifications probably within about 3 weeks of receiving applications, and we are limiting the Institute to 36 educators. So if you're interested in this, if you'd like to apply, you can find more information on our website. As you know, we also have a strong spring course catalog of online courses that we'll be releasing just after the holidays. Currently, registration is open for 4 different courses over 2 different sessions, so 8 total courses. One thing I would note, particularly for those of you from Los Angeles Unified, is that each one of these courses earns 30 hours. That's the equivalent of 6 webinars. So knowing that you have a pretty strict requirement from LAUSD and the kinds of work that you can do and who you can work with, you might consider one of those courses. Again, go to our website. You'll see all the titles and the instructors and the dates. But these 5-week sessions come with about 5 hours of work per week. They involve many of the scholars that you've met through our webinars and are all focused on a very strong inquiry-based approach to the given topic. And then finally, pointing my finger right back at Southern California, registration is now open for a 2-day summit that we'll be co-hosting with the Huntington Library. This education summit is a part of their 100th year, their centennial celebration, and it's scheduled for the evening of March the 6th and all day March 7th. That institute is also limited. 70 participants will be accepted from an application process that's currently open and will be announced in mid-February. So if you're in the Southern California area, the Los Angeles area, and you'd like to join us in person, Libby, Mike, and I will all be there. Please sign up for that with the Huntington, and you can find information on the Huntington Library website for that. Finally, I'd like to thank our Teacher Advisory Council for their annual work. That includes Lee Holder, who I see in the room tonight, and Mariel Herzog, who's in the room. Our Teacher Advisory Council is a very important member of our team in the sense that we ask them to make sure that we're doing work that's relevant and applicable. We ask them to contribute in a whole variety of ways. If any of you who have contributed and been a part of many of our projects would like to be a member of this council for the 2020-21 school year, we'll be accepting applications starting in March. So that's a long introduction to the center and to the work that we do, all of which is intended to get us to this point where I can more officially introduce our guest tonight and our speaker and engage this conversation. David Chappell. David, I should ask, I'm saying your name correctly, right? Chappell?
Yes, you are. Thank you.
Good. See, I'm in Chapel Hill, so sometimes my mind and my mouth don't quite read that word the right way. But I'm so pleased that you could join us from Oklahoma City. David Chappell is a professor of modern U.S. history at University of Oklahoma and has by far the most compelling topic title of any webinar I've done recently, which is, Can the Jonestown Massacre Help Us Understand Suicide Bombings, Mass Shootings, and Other Acts of Terrorism? David, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me. It's great to be here, and thanks to everybody listening out there.
David, a couple of quick things before we begin. Again, I've asked our participants to register questions and thoughts in the chat box, and when that happens, I'll be bringing them to your attention and sort of integrating them as best I can in the flow of what you're sharing. I'm also going to be advancing the slides for you. So I'm usually pretty good at picking up when that space comes in your thinking, but if at any point you'd like me to advance or rewind, just let me know verbally and I'll be happy to do so.
Great.
And I'm going to start actually with a question, if you don't mind. I'm going to put you a little bit on the spot because I think in some ways, because this is such a compelling topic, compelling title of a topic, it really reminds me to some degree of why I think the humanities are important. Just yesterday, in fact, I was in Henrico County, which is a school district just outside of Richmond, Virginia. And I was working with a group of middle grades teachers and their students, actually. And I found myself trying to defend or explain why the humanities are important. And it occurred to me suddenly that as a parent, as an educator, as an adult, one of the questions that's the most common that we have is why? Right? It's when you have little kids, they don't walk around saying what or how, they say, why is this? Why is that? And I wonder from your perspective as a professional historian, certainly you know facts, certainly you tell stories and you sort of make sure that the accuracy is there of the stories that we tell, but you must get a lot of people asking you why. How does that work in your field? Are you the guy who knows the answer to why?
No, I'm not. But unlike some historians and unlike some philosophers of history, I think why questions are legitimate. I don't think that they are based on, a misunderstanding of what historians or, for that matter, scientists can do. Some philosophers of history maintain that we shouldn't ask why questions, and That's just too metaphysical and beyond our competency. I don't think we ever can have fully satisfying answers to the why questions, let alone answers that are beyond debate, at least for the interesting questions, the questions that really animate us and keep us up at night. I think the why questions can be broken down and reinterpreted, and we can ask how something happened and how did the witnesses, come to grips with it. How did they start understanding their relationship as survivors or as participants in one way or another. And we can begin to, pile up speculation and informed speculation and guesswork and have answers to the why questions that are as close as human beings can get. I don't think that's philosophically meaningless, and I don't think that it's um, I don't think it's purely abstract academic navel gazing. I think we really do get in touch. We read the testimony often. We read or see pictures of the human beings that go through it. And I think we feel a kind of empathy. I think we should, be careful to feel humility and not to make assumptions that we understand what the person who, is in this photograph or this drawing from an eyewitness, what that person went through. But I think if we approach it, we really can understand better. And in understanding people who are in a very different situation from ourselves, often, different culture with a different language, different religion, and maybe thousands or millions of years ago, I still think we can get closer, and it helps us understand ourselves.
Yeah, that's a very optimistic response, and I appreciate that, particularly with the topic tonight, and particularly with an audience of educators, all of whom are working with, um, as my children are, literally a generation growing up in terror,
Mm,
or at least the culture of terrorism, the post 9/11 generation, the school shooting generation. So I think you're right in suggesting that, as we are tonight, that you're going to sort of walk us through the ways in which we might think of this, and using one event as an example for how we can ask those questions. But it may not be that there's an answer we're going to give by 8:30 East Coast time, as much
uh-huh.
as a process of thinking this through and helping to grapple with and make sense of these complications.
Well, thank you. I think that after that optimistic answer, I should say I got interested in Jonestown and really a little bit obsessed with it, haunted by it, because I think it is perhaps the biggest challenge within my, rough field of competence. It is the biggest challenge to understanding, and the biggest challenge, uh, as a large public event that everybody remembers, or most people can have some vague idea of what it involved. It it really staggers the imagination and doesn't seem to fit in the historical patterns that we bring to the story, or psychological or literary, dramatic patterns that make us familiar, or make us capable of coping and assimilating an event like this. This is really, really challenging, really, really difficult, and the the title that went on the piece that I wrote for the Washington Post on the anniversary last year of Jonestown um, was not, my idea really. I thought one way we can make meaning out of Jonestown is to learn how the media handle something, and maybe consider um, how Jonestown can help us uh, at least imagine a way of handling um, similar, though still distinct kinds of events. But really, I think deep down, I'm here for you today. I'm here with you people today uh, in a much more uncommitted state. I think part of me really remains baffled by Jonestown, and I think we can get close. I think we can try to work together and maybe look at more evidence, more testimony that has come out since I wrote, um, and get more perspectives, more comparisons. But I think this is about the most difficult thing I've ever written about. I have the least satisfying answer. I'm furthest from an answer to the why question here.
Well, I'm going to go ahead and advance your slides again. I'm going to sort of read your tone and tenor for when you'd like them advanced, but you can also request me to do so. And I'm anxious to sort of understand what you mean by that. So,
Great. Okay. Well, I'm haunted by Jonestown. Everybody I know is haunted by it. I grew up in the 1960s and 70s. I was 19 years old, just out of high school, starting college in 1978. This topic it looked like a mass suicide coming out of the great fear of cults like the Moonies and the Scientology and all of that really was made the headlines quite a bit in the 1970s. But it also seemed to touch political currents in a very disturbing way. There were echoes of Black Power, Black Panther organizations, some sketchy relationships suggesting that people had looked to the Reverend Jim Jones and his People's Temple, the big religious organization that was once very respected and even revered in African American communities and outside of them in the years leading up to what we know now led to Jonestown. So how did these things interact? What kind of religion is at work here? Is it the kind of reassuring and bracing radical religion that promotes social change and brings uh, a region torn by hatred and bigotry closer to justice, the way the religion often functioned in the civil rights struggle associated with people like Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King? Most of what I wrote about and did research about as a historian was related to that movement, the movement that many Americans really like to feel good about. And one of the things about that is they see a mass religion that empowers people, emboldens them to band together with similarly situated people in their community and find solidarity and courage to fight, and even to fight successfully against tremendous odds when fighting in the past had been unsuccessful. Jonestown really interrupted that and baffled me and other people I know. It's hard to assimilate it, to relate it to past patterns we have. I mentioned this a bit earlier. Terrible things happen in human history. It's what history is about. The mass slaughters that we call war are the basic punctuation marks of history, and wars that our own family or our own selves go through never get easy or routine, but there is at least a vast and rich literature as old as written language on war and its effects on soldiers and their families and bystanders. Terrorist attacks are not a completely new thing. They are increasingly familiar, and those are in some ways more haunting than war because we don't have that long-standing literature that goes back to ancient times and all through medieval and early modern times. Um, and this has the Jonestown Massacre has perhaps elements of a terrorist attack, perhaps things in common that I think we want to think about. But I think at Jonestown, if you could try to pinpoint what's haunting about it, is we really don't know what happened. We don't know whether it really was a suicide event. It's a suicide. It's a lot of suicides. It appears 912 of them, but it's suicide on such a scale as we've never seen before. we know that suicide is awful when it happens to one person we loved or worked with, but it almost always is just one person. As horrible as it is, it seems to have a limit that way. Well, this suicide, if that's what it was, is almost 1,000 people, and it happened very suddenly and disturbed hundreds of families and hundreds of communities. And the recent horror of mass shootings in schools and elsewhere, those we tend at least to have a psychological explanation for, and we have a gun control explanation for, and we, at least in our imaginations, we may differ on how much it's a psychological problem and how much it's a gun control problem, but at least people have something to fight over and define themselves over with respect to mass shootings. And there's some hope that, if only people would have the nerve to address or devote the resources to my solution, then, we feel like we could maybe get on top of the horror of mass shootings. And this somehow Jonestown doesn't seem to respond to that. Maybe we could just take a look at some bare facts. 912 people dead on November 18, 1978, in a rural encampment founded about a year before by the Reverend Jim Jones. He called it Jonestown. His followers, who maybe were over 1,000 for a while, their population had declined a bit. People had left. Most of the people were African Americans from California, where Jim Jones had been established, and had, as I said, a tremendously popular and celebrated ministry. It's a crime of some sort, but what kind of crime is it, and who committed the crime? These are very troubling questions. Many of the dead were small children, babies even. Can we say that they did not commit suicide? I think most people believe that children don't have the will and the means, and it's extremely rare that children commit suicide. And babies, I think, most people would agree that somewhere there's a line in there where some of the 912 at least did not commit suicide but were murdered. Even if their parents agreed to commit suicide the same day and might mercifully have thought to themselves, as we imagine, I'm going to take my child with me to this wonderful place that I've been promised we're going to, and to get away from the horrible, horrible calamities that we are anticipating, that they believed would be visited upon them if they didn't get out of this world pretty quickly. But it's a kind of homicide, or even murder, perhaps, for some of these 912 people. So there's crime involved, but maybe crime by deranged people, or people who were under some sort of spell by a charismatic leader. Just maybe get a visual aerial photo of the bodies that were scattered about. Absorbing this is a real shock to the American psyche, seeing images like this after Jonestown. How many people are there? They were scattered out, some of them in the woods surrounding the encampment. I have not seen a film that captures the entire scene. You will see little pieces of it. It's a massive, massive disturbing fact, an inconvenient reality that left a huge dent, or a hole, you might say, in the American consciousness. We can't forget it, and yet we have trouble accounting for it. We have trouble explaining what happened, why it happened, how it happened even, and fitting it into the larger story that we call our story, our history. It's a big public event, as big as war, and bigger than most mass shootings, bigger than all mass shootings we've experienced so far. Uh, as big as the biggest natural disasters like earthquakes and plagues and famines. Yet this is clearly a man-made event. It's more like a war or a mass shooting or a terrorist attack than it is like an earthquake or a flood or a tornado. And yet there is some mysterious force that's beyond the will, or seems to be beyond the will of most of the people involved in it.
Professor, we've got a couple of clarifying questions from our audience. I'm going to combine these actually. Jamie is curious if you know where in California these folks were from, these people were from. And Mike asks why a majority was African American. Was this a particular focus of Jones, or were they drawn to him for some reason? Can you explain who these people are a little bit more in depth?
You know, I'm going to get to that. The
Okay.
investigators tried to ask those questions, and I wish I had a simple answer. He did have a ministry, as you'll see. We'll get into this.
Okay.
That was socially focused, and helping people deal with their landlords if their heat got turned off. He took a tremendous interest in African American culture. Jim Jones was not himself African American. We'll have his picture will come up in a bit here. Um, and he did have quite a few white followers. I don't know if anybody has done a count as precisely what the breakdown is, but most witnesses say the majority. Most of them were black, as they said then, or African American. And I do have, uh,
So I mean it forward?
yeah, yeah, let's do that. We'll get to
We can circle back for both
in,
Jamie
yeah,
and Mike coming up,
in the
sure.
Bay Area in California. Okay, so this is just a representation. I think a particularly poignant one. That the paper cup you see in the lower left corner. It's the way that people administered the poison in the. You see the tub full of the sweet soft drink that people drank, laced with cyanide and barbiturates. The adults, it seems, did know what they were doing. Um, so there are people who had joined radical or left-leaning or very socially liberal organizations. They wanted to help the poor. They wanted to empower people in poor communities. Is it Does this have some sort of left versus right struggle that we can, refer to understand it? Is it black against white? The people were animated against racism, and Jim Jones preached against racism and the horrible damage that it did to people in various ways. Not all of the people were poor or lower income, but a significant number of them were. And Jones, very deliberately sought to speak to and speak for and work on behalf of poor people, and earned a following. It seems all the testimony is he was very popular. People thought he was genuine and much more effective than competing organizations or agencies. Was there a male female thing going on? A charismatic minister? There were certainly stories about his having sexual relationships with some of his female followers. And then, of course, there's just, other questions about the sexism that's involved, the roles that women were playing in an organization like this. Those are all dynamics of modern history and even pre-modern history that we try to use, or sort of spectrums or indexes we can use to try to calibrate what sort of conflict, what sort of drama led to this horrifying outcome. Is it a struggle of ethnicity? Is it old versus young? There are a lot of young people who follow Jim Jones, but interestingly, we find a lot of old people as well. There's clearly something religious going on, but I think the more you look at it, the more difficult it gets to assimilate into our understanding of conflicts like those that are listed, the familiar sort of major ones. Maybe we could go to the next slide, just more to give you uh, a sense of the scale and the shock that's involved in assimilating. This all happens within an hour, it seems, of one day in November 1978. So a question that I came to try for this article I wrote for the Washington Post to throw into the mix is, did they die in vain? Did they all die in vain? Maybe it's the wrong question to ask. How did this happen? Why did this happen? What was the motivation of Jim Jones? And what were the motivations of his various followers? Could we classify them with different types of motivation? Maybe that's a question that's futile and won't lead us to a satisfying answer. But maybe if we thought of it in more practical terms, I have the next slide has the question. Uh, did they die in vain? Maybe if we thought about what we could learn from their death, whether they intended us to learn something from it or not, maybe we'd approach some kind of understanding. Maybe we'd be able to extract some sort of meaning from it that would render our relationship to this event a little bit less terrifying and unsettling. But we really do need at least to ask uh, a more primary question: what happened, before we can know whether they died in vain, let alone why it happened. We have to know what happened. And I think I want to just share a little bit of that. Uh, what happened and how can we know what happened? And I just want to give you a little bit of background of how I approach things. I teach history and I write books about people who have tried to assert their human rights, usually by organizing into large associations. I've published 3 books on the African American freedom struggle in cities of the American North and South. Mostly I've written about people trying to reclaim their new constitutional rights, those battles that spread from the end of slavery in 1865 right up to the present, define much of U.S. history, modern history as we think of it. We see tremendous changes, and I think, I'm not the only student of those events that finds there's a lot of struggle left to go. A lot of victories that were once won have been chipped away at or maybe reversed in some ways. You can't ever leave it alone, but there have been some tremendous victories, some tremendous gains that I think most of us, even in our most cynical and pessimistic hours, recognize and feel thankful for. Explaining how African American efforts to restore their rights shaped U.S. history has been my job for the past 30 years or so. And that led me to this baffling moment with Jonestown that I've probably made clear to you how that struck me. My experience with the patterns of civil rights struggle, armed struggle, underground struggle, struggle within the churches, struggle in labor unions, struggle in fraternal organizations and in the streets and in the courts, all that turned out to be pretty useless with Jonestown. There were people who had come from civil rights organizations, who had been associated with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or with the Black Panthers and other organizations, who ended up finding Jim Jones a kind of leader that was carrying on that mission, the mission that they had found in those earlier organizations. And maybe he was somebody who was going to stay with it. He was eager, it seemed, to work with them, live in their communities. He adopted children who were orphaned in the community. He really seemed to be dedicated to the people, and he inspired confidence among hundreds and even thousands of people. Clearly, religion is a big question, and what exactly religion has to do with the Jonestown Massacre, I think, can help us get a grip on how it unfolded, on how people traveled down the road that ultimately led to Jonestown, and also maybe how we can extract some meaning from it that will, um, help us learn something that we could perhaps help us avoid or mitigate the effects of something like this in the future. What's religion got to do with it? Can the knowable facts help us make any sense of it? The Jonestown encampment had a religious name, People's Temple. We can see a picture of Jim Jones on the next slide. And the encampment there, the 912 people who got there, had been led there by a man with a religious inspiration and a religious title, had studied African American religion and African American religious leaders and movements. So that, I think, is a question that ought to be in our minds. The other big elephant in the room, another R word, is race. What's race got to do? Racism, the classification of people. Maybe we can go to the next slide. The man you see here is one of the first people to get to the scene as a journalist, reporter Bernard Shaw. Follow him to the next slide, please. He got on the first plane load of journalists who rushed to the scene of Jonestown. Reports of massive U.S. casualties started coming in on the ticker tape in Washington and New York. And when he got off the plane and made his way to the encampment, you see him quoted here. It was an event that stunned him and shaped his whole consciousness, his whole understanding of what it means to be a modern human being living in the kind of world we live in. And in the United States, I began to realize there were hundreds of dead. They didn't know. They thought, maybe a couple of dozen. There'd been some kind of event, and they were dispatched there by networks and newspapers to figure out what happened. They'd committed suicide. Most of them were black. I got the same feeling I had when I received the bulletin that King had been shot. Just 10 years before this, Martin Luther King had been murdered in Memphis, Tennessee. And that was an event that, left a similar dent, a similar hole in people's understanding of the world they live in. How could this have happened? And Shaw's reaction, shared by many people, was, this is that kind of event. It just makes you stop and look around you and say, something is happening to my people and my society right now that is that devastating and that incomprehensible. We will never forget this, and it is baffling. We don't know what to do with it. A congressional committee was dispatched, partly because a U.S. congressman, Leo Ryan, who represented the district that the People's Temple had been established in Northern California. We've got some quotations from the Congressional Investigative Report. And here we get to the question of who the people were. And if you're looking for exact percentages, you're going to be disappointed here. I'll just warn you of that. But they do try to get a sense of the proportions of which group is larger than others. So they began to comb through to find passports and other identifying documents, contact relatives, an awful lot of people. It was a huge task, a very expensive task of congressional staff time. College graduates out of upper middle class backgrounds who had grown up in privilege and even luxury were one distinct group in among the dead found at Jonestown. In some cases, these people, their friends and relatives testified, had been alienated by the emptiness of their family's wealth. So it does have something to do maybe with rich versus poor, but it doesn't mean that all the victims out there are poor. A larger number, especially young blacks, had their roots in the other end of the American social and economic spectrum. The team has done their best to just assemble the facts and speak as modestly as they can, and only make such conclusions as the evidence allows them to make. But this larger group of people came from poor ghetto neighborhoods and limited education. Some had been drug addicts, prostitutes, and street hustlers. And I should say that one of the precedents for Jim Jones's ministry was he thought that many civil rights organizations like the NAACP and even Martin Luther King's um, Southern Christian Leadership Conference and even the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee reached people who were the kind of people who went to college. And he got some inspiration from Malcolm X, and from the Black Panthers, who were very dedicated to reaching out to poorer people who didn't have much hope of getting a college education, didn't have the preparation, didn't have the income, didn't have the social experience that made that seem a possibility in their lives. And like Malcolm X and like the founders of the Black Panthers, Huey Newton and Eldridge Cleaver and others, Jim Jones wanted to reach out to people who had lives of crime and to help them get off of drugs and get on the right side of the law and develop a safer, more stable pattern of life for themselves. Okay, this congressional team keeps investigating and find a still larger number of members were elderly. Again, this is a predominantly black group. Most of the old people among the dead were black people who had come out of the San Francisco ghetto. They found in Jim Jones an abiding and protective concern. Despite the harshness of life in Jonestown, they regarded Jonestown as preferable to the poor housing they had left behind. Again, we get it's very clear that something about a struggle between rich and poor is implicated here. That is certainly imprinted in the carnage that we see at Jonestown, the tragedy, if we can call it that. They also found a warm sense of family and acceptance within the People's Temple community that they did not have before joining. The loneliness that old people, particularly poor old people, feel is a social phenomenon. It's part of an explanation of part of what happened. And this very careful investigative team under strict orders to stay within what the evidence will allow them, and having the means to go and track down and interview people to find out whatever they can, they made these summaries. At the end, by the way, if you're interested in this, I have some suggestions for further reading. I don't think any single human being is capable of assimilating all the evidence and testimony that has come out since the Congressional Investigating Team published its report a year after the disaster. But if you want to pursue it further, people have written books and assembled interviews and testimony. You can see some of the sources at the end of this slideshow. I think you'll have access to that. The congressional team can go a little bit further. Next slide. Also found a substantial middle class group, middle class blacks and whites, who came out of strong fundamentalist family backgrounds and were attracted to what they saw as the evangelical nature of People's Temple. And I have to say that when we think of fundamentalist and evangelical, we might have a different spin on those terms than people did in 1978. 1978 was just before people heard of the moral majority and just before groups like that became extremely politicized and became involved in the Republican Party, many of them leaving the Democratic Party, leaving the allegiance they had to a born-again Christian president, that is Jimmy Carter, feeling let down or that they were insufficiently served by the Carter administration, which had good relations with, this demographic constituency, black and white, by the way, especially in the South, the white South as well as the black South. So when we think of fundamentalist and evangelical in a political sense, we may be thinking of something quite different from what those words meant to the congressional staffers who use those adjectives to describe the middle class people and their backgrounds. People who had evangelical backgrounds sometimes had very politically conservative orientations, but they were also sometimes people who were very active in social ministries, helping the poor, helping advance civil rights organizations, and work for rights of people in poor neighborhoods. A very complicated picture that changed a great deal in the late 1970s when the political culture of the United States and many, many other nations around the world became so much more desecularized, if you will, in the Middle East and Iran. That this is a year before the Ayatollah Khomeini and the Islamic Revolution, a real shock to modern sensibilities. The idea that a revolution would come out of a very, very conservative, old-fashioned religious tradition that tried to restore something old rather than to realize some vision of the future. That was a big shock and turned out to be the trend on both sides of many conflicts in the Middle East. The state of Israel politics in the state of Israel became much more religious in this very period. And it's one of the reasons why Jim Jones's organizing and the bloodshed are so interesting, is that it's at the beginning of this period of the politicization of religion, but it's not clear what the politics of the Jonestown Massacre itself are. It's clear that he had a sort of, left-leaning, socially liberal approach to civil rights and fighting racism and fighting poverty and so on, at least in the beginning. It's not so clear what was in his mind or what his political goals were, if any, when he initiated the suicide ritual that they had rehearsed. Maybe we could go to the next slide. Religion, some people wanted to say that this is all about religion and about the danger of a particular kind of religion called cults. That was another huge issue in the 1970s. I alluded to that at the beginning of the discussion. The congressional team found that many of the younger people had little, if any, religious motivation in joining People's Temple. Rather, they tended to be compelled by humanitarian interests. Altruistic and idealistic, they were impressed by Jones's involvement in social causes and what they saw as the political sophistication of the People's Temple. If they had any religious motive, the team summarized the vast evidence that they combed through and organized. If they had any religious motive, it lay chiefly in Jones's seeming concrete application of Judeo-Christian principles. In other words, they thought other people who professed Christian principles were hypocrites and didn't care about the poor and society's outcasts and society's needy. Their motivation evolved, and here's one theory about what happened to the religious mission. It evolved into the socialist Marxist agnostic philosophy that Jones had by then adopted. And it seems that perhaps Jones, or perhaps many of the people in the community, were inspired by the tremendous political sophistication of people like Huey Newton and Eldridge Cleaver, who were then had fallen on hard times, but still had a following, people who remembered the activities of the Black Panthers, the efforts to elect representatives who would be more faithful to the needs of their communities in the Bay Area. And maybe even one of the reasons that Jones went to the Bay Area was that he wanted to be a part of that kind of ferment and that kind of activism in the streets, and maybe his church could play some sort of role in it. And the theory here that some of the congressional team express is that he had moved toward the Black Panthers, or towards a certain memory of the Black Panthers' international socialist vision of the future, and was maybe finding Christianity and the biblical grounding of his leadership somewhat insufficient or outdated. That's just a theory. I don't know how well that works, but the congressional team was voicing the perspective of some experts. It's controversial. Not everybody thought that, but that's one point of view. The team wanted to understand just what this meant in terms of conventional ways to understand religion. The People's Temple may have been a bona fide church. Jim Jones came from Indiana and had started his ministry there and felt moved or called to go to California. Was it still entitled to a tax exemption, which it had in fact been granted by the IRS since 1962? And was it similarly entitled to First Amendment protections that Jones's organization, sought and received? Jones hired a lawyer who had become famous for representing the Black Panthers. In fact, he hired two lawyers for a while who had become famous in the Bay Area for representing the Black Panthers. And they did a great deal of legal work for Jones. Jones believed that he was persecuted. He referred to the congressional investigation that flew down, led by Congressman Leo Ryan, just on the eve of what became the mass murder or mass suicide. And one of the issues involved there was the tax exemption and the First Amendment protections. People in Congress, including Leo Ryan, thought that maybe the State Department or the American Embassy, or the American Consulate, in Guyana should intervene, should perhaps bring a Marine detachment from the embassy to investigate, to see if people's rights were being violated in Jonestown, to see if Jones was manipulating people, to see if drugs were being used, perhaps laws of Guyana being violated. There were reports from people who had left the temple, some of which had been published in the press. There were reports that people were being held there against their will and maybe, brainwashed or manipulated in some way that they couldn't really be responsible for themselves. And Jones said this is a witch hunt, and he had a lawyer standing out as a spokesman, fending off inquiries from the press and uh, from the congressional delegation that traveled there, as you'll see. We are getting around to the top of the hour. I believe we have about a half an hour left.
That's correct.
Do you want to? I feel like I have been lecturing here, and I'm happy to keep doing that. But I thought maybe people. Am I seeing this number here? Is that people who want to ask questions?
No, so we do have some questions that are queuing up, and as you've been moving through this, particularly the report from the congressional investigating team, it feels like you're tying some threads here together, and we've sort of gone back and forth between thinking about who the victims were and then who Jim
Mhm.
Jones is, and it seems like it's so. I think we're just sort of taking it in now, and if you've got a few more bars to go, please sing them, and then we'll certainly have time to wrap this up. But it feels like things are starting to crystallize some.
Well, I hope together we can work to crystallize it.
And
Okay.
because we've taken a pause, though, I am going to bring in Mike West, who asks a little bit more of a what question, and in fact, he asks, what was the Guyana's point of view?
I'm sorry, the what?
In the country in Guyana, what was their point of view? Ghana.
Guyana. Yeah, it's
Guyana.
it's
Yeah.
not it's not clear. They The Guyanese authorities seemed a little mystified. Um, they There were people who had businesses and employment, serving the Jonestown community, but they did not learn much. They were sort of kept at arm's length by Jones's organization. The government did not uh, did not announce, as I recall, there was some effort to get a statement from Guyanese officials, and they just went, after the massacre, it was just, sort of anodyne, what you'd expect is just a terrible tragedy. They didn't claim any responsibility for what had happened, and I mean, it's actually a very good question, and I think it's pretty clear. I don't know. I don't have a very good answer for it. Um, Obviously,
Well,
it's a country of millions of people, and uh, you'd expect to have a great variety. But I think it's also fair to say that there wasn't a lot of information about Jonestown in Guyana or anywhere else. It was quite secretive, and they were way, way, way out in a rural area. They weren't, in contrast to People's Temple in California, where they were right in an urban neighborhood, and a part of it, everybody knew. He was in the press and attending meetings and ceremonies all the time. They were really out in the sticks and getting away from any other organized form of human society. They were starting their own community, and they didn't interact more than they absolutely had to. And it was Jones and a couple other trusted associates, like the lawyers I mentioned, Mark Lane and Charles Gary, who did the interacting, not the average um, member of the temple.
great, thank you. And Karen Day had a follow-up question about how the Ghana government may have worked with the U.S. to get to him, but it sounds like what you're suggesting is that there's a real split there, that they really weren't, or we just don't know how involved they were.
Well, after the the massacre, the Guyanese troops went in and helped clean up. I believe my recollection is, it's funny, it's been quite a while since I've looked at much of this evidence, but it was mostly Guyanese troops who went in and, counted the bodies. There were American newsmen, there were officials from the embassy, and the congressional delegation, the some of which members were killed, and we'll get to that, were shot. Not They didn't drink the poison, uh, but some of them were not shot, and they survived, and they were there. They were right there on the ground, very close by, and were also witnesses to the Guyanese troops going in to help count the bodies and identify them and all of that. American officials came down. I believe some military, as well as State Department personnel. Massive cleanup operation, obviously, and to get the bodies shipped back home when they could find relatives to claim them and so on. Maybe just go on here a little bit, a little more information. It's a little back. Can we go
Sorry
back?
about that.
That's all right. My fault. Jones was increasingly secretive. There had been suspicions. There was an article published in New West magazine in 1977 that seemed perhaps to precipitate his decision to leave California and go to Guyana. He bought the property and staked it out, but he was becoming controversial because people were reporting that there was some funny business with the finances, that maybe they were collecting people's social security checks and welfare checks for them and not, allowing the recipients to get the money. Sort of cult-like behavior. Um, and that was disturbing to people. And a couple of people, defectors. People used the word defectors. Several of them had talked to reporters, and there was actually an organization of relatives, parents, and siblings of People's Temple members who thought that this is another one of these cults, like the Moonies, and also like the Charles Manson, uh, small scale cult that also was involved in horrifying violence, also in California, not so long before this. The comparison that was often made at the time. Um, so he was increasingly secretive, and he wanted, it seemed, to keep the press at arm's length and to resist delegations from Congress or elsewhere to see what was happening. Uh, Jones told his lawyer, Mark Lane, this is Mark Lane himself, who survived, reported, he eventually wrote a book about this, but he talked to the press a fair amount after the massacre. And Mark Lane said that Jones had wanted to stage a comeback, like Eldridge Cleaver, the former Black Panther, who was a best-selling author, really something of a celebrity, a very popular figure who fled the United States, charged with homicide, and was in exile for a while in Cuba and then in Algeria. He became disillusioned after several years, went to Paris and started negotiating to find a way back to the United States. And he came back to the United States with considerable fanfare in 1977, a year before the Jonestown event, and really before Jones left for Guyana. And this was an inspiration to Jones, but he was getting some heat and anticipated more. And so, apparently it was a decision of prudence. He wanted to go to Guyana to get away from the bad publicity, but perhaps to be left in peace and allow his community to flourish, getting away from the temptations of modern urban life and having a kind of back to the land mentality. Eldridge Cleaver is a fascinating character who also became a born again Christian and, found, made the journey from politics, perhaps more conventional revolutionary politics, to uh, evangelical Christianity, and declared himself a patriot. Said, he'd been confused before. He wrote another best-selling book, but it did not sell with the same audience that his first book, the Black Panther book called Soul on Ice, which was published in the late 60s. His post-return born-again Christian biography was called Soul on Fire, and it sold really well among this emerging, growing population, increasingly visible population of born-again evangelical Christians, white and black. This may be a little digression, a little detail about Cleaver there. He teamed up with the Watergate felon, convicted Watergate conspirator Charles Colson, and they both became evangelical missionaries who had missions in American prisons and worked for prison reform, an issue that sort of died out for a while, but has had a real comeback, not always associated with religion, as it often was then. All right, so other facts that the investigators, the congressional investigators, and now I'm also drawing from the press who arrived. The NBC sent a team, as did the San Francisco Chronicle and the Washington Post, with the congressional delegation. So Representative Leo Ryan, who represented the district that the People's Temple had been located in, and many of whose constituents were in Guyana, were in the encampment with Jones. He had gone down there. He tried to get other people from Congress to go with him, including Dan Quayle, who later became vice president, but everybody turned him down, everybody on the appropriate committees that he asked. He'd only asked a few, but got a very bad response. He was really the only congressman who was interested enough to go. He brought some staff members with him and these media people. I forget, I say in the Washington Post piece, which I think many of you have, I go through the numbers of exactly who was there. But what happened was that Representative Ryan went to the encampment and negotiated with Jones's lawyer, Mark Lane, to just be allowed in and just talk to some of his constituents, people whose families had, said, we really want to hear if they're okay, to go in and just talk to them. And some people who were there came up to some of the, members of the People's Temple, came up to the newsmen and to members of Ryan's staff and conveyed to them verbally and with a note, hey, we really want to get out of here. Can you help us? And when they left after that visit, when Ryan and the news people were preparing to leave, they were riding on a truck. They were, getting into a truck to leave Jonestown, and some of the residents of Jonestown jumped onto the truck and made it clear that they wanted to take the truck out of there, which was sort of alarming, not only to Representative Ryan, who had gotten a standing ovation when he made a speech at a meal where the whole community assembled. And he said, I've talked to many of you here today, and many of you tell me things like, Jonestown is the best thing that ever happened to you in your lives. The People's Temple is the best thing in your life. And he got a standing ovation. It's a strong affirmation, or so it seemed, that most of the people there were not scared or, looking for a way out. But some clearly were, and a bunch got onto the truck. That truck went back to the airstrip where they had landed. There were two planes they flew in on, both the press and Ryan and his staff members, and also a couple of members from this relatives group. Not all of them were allowed to go into Jonestown, only some of them were. It's sort of a complicated picture. But when they go back to the airstrip after this visit, where they uh, were going to, get on the planes and leave, a truck showed up and opened fire on the press and Jones's people. I'm sorry, Ryan's people. They killed Ryan. It's the only sitting congressperson who's ever been assassinated in American history. And killed a reporter for the San Francisco Chronicle, Greg Robinson, killed NBC reporter Don Harris, and NBC cameraman Bob Brown. So this is the theme here, is that they don't want news about Jonestown getting out. A third member, well, I'll go into the details here. I think you can read for yourselves. Soundman Stephen Sung played dead. A lot of people did that, and they survived. Washington Post writer Charles Krause, who published one of the best, most informative of the early dispatches from Jonestown, and several defectors from the temple. They got on planes and started getting out of there, radioed distress. Actually, they only got one of the planes was disabled. They only got one out of there. And it was then when the men that Jones had sent in the second truck to shoot at the people getting on the planes, when they got back to Jonestown, only then did Jones call everybody together and initiate the suicide rehearsal, which they had rehearsed. And there were some reports of that. They were vague. It wasn't clear, but people said, yeah, they're rehearsing these suicide rituals. There was some fear that this was going to happen. Though I think in many ways, nobody really imagined that something like this could happen. We look in retrospect at those vague reports and think, oh my God, we should have known something. But it's the kind of thing that, who could imagine a mass suicide, almost 1,000 people? Okay, well, I've already made that point. So they didn't drink the Kool-Aid. Surprise, surprise. It was actually a cheap off-brand called Flavor Aid. Kool-Aid was not happy about the.
I was going to say Kool-Aid must have really, really been upset that that's become, a cultural phrase that we still have 40 years
Yep,
later.
but who can you sue?
Right.
Uh, and this, I think, this is one of the most haunting lines. Odell Rhodes was the only survivor uh, who actually witnessed the event. Some people got away. A couple of people got away before the suicide actually started. They knew something was going wrong. Very few, but Odell Rhodes actually saw it happening, did not drink the Flavor Aid, and she wandered off into the woods and was found by these Guyanese troops who later came in to recover the bodies. And she told her story to this Washington Post writer who'd been shot at but played dead and survived. Um, and there's a citation of his article, and I recommend you can get that on most libraries will be able to track that down for you if you don't have access to Nexus Lexis or ProQuest historical newspapers. Uh, it's a good intro. I mean, yeah, you might even be able to get it on the internet.
Mhm.
Um, and there's cyanide and barbiturates. He knew enough. He knew, perhaps he and other trusted advisors, or maybe not, maybe just he himself knew how you kill that many people. And somehow he believed that they would drink what he said they should drink.
In some ways, that's a nice segue to some questions that are starting to bubble up. I'd like to bring to your attention. We've got
Please.
about 10 minutes left. And I'll invite you to either dive into this or to figure out the best way to navigate it. And I'm going to pull together Susie's question and Grace's question. And it's really a connection, it seems, and actually an earlier question tonight.
Maybe we could put the next slide up just while we're doing questions.
Yeah, sure will. Couple of questions, and really it's this notion of charismatic leaders and political agendas, and the connection that you made between the Black Panthers, between Malcolm X, between now Jim Jones. Susie brings up David Koresh.
Yeah.
He also brings up Donald Trump. And Grace sort of sums it up by maybe a little bit more in a third person way, saying, what does this word cult really mean in the current political discourse? But are you starting to see some trends between this kind of charisma and these kinds of intentions?
Well, trend is a strong word for me, and I'm very hesitant. I'm hesitant for two reasons. One issue is, is Jones like Charles Manson, and is he like David Koresh? I think that looks like a pretty easy yes. But were all of them destined to lead to, an end like this? And, what David Koresh pulls off is very different in many ways from what either Manson or Jones did. And you could think of other examples too. Cult was it's really hard in the literature on cults. There was an extensive literature of social science researchers, psychologists trying to figure out how we can deal with cults, how we can unbrainwash people. And if you read it rigorously, a lot of the literature, it's using the word cult to cover a whole lot of things that we just don't understand. How does mind control, how does brainwashing really work? They did a lot of research after, prisoners of war, American and Allied prisoners of war during the Korean War were experimented on with, conditioning, and it's very frightening stuff. But it's easy to exaggerate, and it's easy to draw a line between the really ugly and negative stuff that leads to mass murder and what we might think of as perfectly normal religion or perfectly normal crowd activity at a sporting event or a theatrical event when people are in crowds. This has been a problem for social scientists. It was a huge fad in the late 19th century. People wrote about, what is it when people get into a crowd? They lose their individual identity and they do things that they wouldn't do as an individual. They'll murder people, they'll lynch people, they'll riot, they'll blow up a bank, they'll burn a building down, and or they'll do something accidentally that's just crazy, like they're panicky. Somebody says there's a fire, and there isn't a fire, and they stampede out of a stadium, killing dozens of people because they're just afraid that if they don't get to the exit, something terrible is going to happen. And it's a very, very uncertain ground. There's good research. You can find reliable um, patterns in some of the data, very carefully defined. But I just don't. I think the more you stare at Jonestown and the more you look at the literature on things like cults and charisma, the harder it is to see where the kind of charisma that somebody you like Amy Carter, was an example of, the president's daughter during the same period. People didn't like Jimmy Carter, but everybody liked Amy Carter. Nobody was gonna. Why is that kind of charisma? Why do we use the same word? And is it the same thing? And does that help us understand how somebody uses his or her charisma to lead to mass murder or to some other, horrifying uh, destruction? What do we really know? I mean, some psychopathic killer may not be charismatic, but has skill with weapons or with poisons or something, or is able to develop that skill. I don't know. Do we have something essential there, or is it peripheral to the issue of how we get to 912 dead bodies?
Yeah, and it's funny as you were describing that, Jacqueline and I were having a little bit of a chat back and forth, and uh, I agree, and I didn't intend to put Malcolm X in the same category as these others who have done really horrific things. But I think what you're discussing is the ingredient, the role of charisma, whether it's for good or for ill, whether it's for positive or for evil, as Ricardo says, and just the ways in which we as a culture, as a group, as a mob, sometimes kind of respond to that persuasion. And maybe that's where the title for tonight's session comes from as well, which is just how to understand how people engage in these horrific things, often in a group rather than individually.
Maybe the next slide would, be helpful. Uh, and please, more questions. I'm really counting on you people to help me get a couple steps further on this. Are we near the end here?
We are, yeah, just a few more minutes, but go ahead and wrap up with these final slides.
All right. Well, I think, maybe we've talked about this, and I will the people have access to the slides afterwards?
Yes.
Okay. I really hope y'all will look at the last ones on the bibliography, but yeah, just a couple of things here. Maybe we've talked about some of this. We want opportunity, means, and motive. Murder is a difficult thing. We want a jury to be able to say that person intended to do it. Why did he intend to do it? It's a sketchy thing, but we are usually confident that a jury can distinguish between when they have evidence of a motive. If he had this motive, you would expect him to behave in the following way. He didn't just hit the guy once with the lead pipe. He hit him 7 times right on the top of his head. That looks like evidence of a motive, of an intention to kill. We may be able to talk about the motives of Jim Jones, and our speculation, I think, is not ridiculous there. I think it's meaningful. It's plausible. I think we can feel fairly confident that he didn't want publicity. But what about the other 911 people there? What are their motives? And we really need to know what they did, what they were thinking, if we're going to understand an event like this. Maybe one more slide we can throw in here. People use the word massacre. They also use the word Holocaust, incidentally, if you look it up. The Jonestown Holocaust. It's not as common as massacre. Um, I think I will leave you with one last slide. I don't have anything simple for you. I don't have any neat takeaway. In fact, I don't really like that word takeaway in a situation like this. But maybe the way that we look at this and remember it and self-consciously discuss it with one another could help us understand that if there is a crazy man or woman out there who wants to be remembered, who wants to do something historic, who wants to be a martyr or a prophet who will not be forgotten, this is one way that they ensure it. And the media play a role. We all play a role in a sense of watching that story and being the audience. It's a very ticklish question about, our right to know and the freedom of the press and so on. But maybe what we have to think about is if you've got a religious fanatic who wants to become as memorable as Charles Manson or as Martin Luther King or as Malcolm X, one way to do that is to do the most horrifying thing you can imagine, something more horrifying than anybody's been able to imagine before. That person will surely be remembered. And maybe our even talking about it like this is planting the seeds for somebody else who wants that kind of publicity, who somebody else who wants to make that kind of impact on history. Thank you very much.
David, thank you. I have to admit, my brow is furrowed, and this is an extremely interesting way to address and to consider, particularly from an historian's perspective, something that is, in some ways, mind-boggling. I think this last question, this last slide, in some ways sums that up. If we can't really explain it, our human minds love to organize and find patterns and try to figure stuff out, but sometimes that's just not possible. I've got one final question for you, actually, and I would encourage uh, any of our participants to continue to log questions, and I could forward them. But one question I have for you, and we're just a little bit over time, so we're going to try to keep this pretty tight and contained. Professor, when you work with students at University of Oklahoma, how do they grapple with these kinds of questions, particularly in the age of the terror culture?
I think they're pretty good about saying what we should not do. They do
Hmm.
not like shooter drills. They think that that's, I'm surprised about the near unanimity on that.
Yeah,
Um, they do not think that teachers should be armed. Uh,
yeah.
I'm also surprised at the near unanimity on that. At least, the people in my classes, it's not exactly a scientific sample. The voters don't seem to agree with them on a lot of this, though hard to tell, hard to measure what the voters think directly. Um, I think, we struggle. And every now and then, my students surprise me. In fact, I tell them it's their job to surprise me, and they do quite a bit. Um, I think what they do is they immerse themselves in the testimony. They immerse themselves in the record, and you don't find what you're looking for. I tell them it's the old cliche about the needle in the haystack. What you got to do is they come to me with, I want to find out, such and such. I want to find out why Jim Jones did what he did. And I tell them, you're looking for the old needle in the haystack, and you're probably not going to find it. What you got to do is set up a research project for yourself, a quest, a, a, a search where you're going to dig in, you're going to get your hands dirty and figure out what makes people tick, people who are different from me, and just go in as deep as you can. It will change you. You got a haystack. You got to chew through the hay. You got to sort through it. Find a project that if you do find the needle, you'll be able to make sense out of it. But more to the point, given that you're probably not going to find the needle because it ain't there, you have a project that processes all that hay into something nutritious and helpful.
And that's with all due respect to my wonderful colleagues in the STEM fields, this is why the humanities are important, to find that needle in the haystack.
Right.
Professor, thank you so much for joining us tonight and leading the conversation. Have a wonderful holiday. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Same to you and to all the people listening. Appreciate it.
So folks, you will have a chance to get this, both a recording of tonight's webinar as well as the PowerPoint. That includes the short bibliography of further readings that Professor Chappell has included. That's this slide and the next one. And again, we'll make sure that we make that available to you. Thank you again for joining us tonight for the Humanities in Class webinar series. Keep track of all the work that we do at the National Humanities Center through our social media. That includes a very active Twitter feed as well as our Facebook page. And you can have updates for not only changes and new things that we're offering, but reminders of the sessions coming up. Visit our website and you'll find the application portals for the various activities at the center next summer that I mentioned to you as well. Our next session is scheduled for December the 10th. I hope to see many of you there. In a moment, I'm going to launch the post-webinar evaluation. Please take a moment to complete that before you close your window, and you'll be able to download your certificate of attendance. We've got 2 more sessions before Christmas break. I hope to see most, if not all of you, at one or more of those 2 sessions. Have a great day at school tomorrow. We will see you again at our next Humanities in Class webinar series. Good night, everyone.